Hello. Thank you all for making the time to attend this presentation today. I really appreciate it. My name is Quentin Sedlacek, and I'm a faculty member at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. And I'm here today to talk with you about some findings and implications for English language teaching from a multi-site interdisciplinary survey of college instructors who teach about African American language. And I'm here today on behalf of myself and my colleagues Ann Charity Hudley from Stanford University and Christine Mallinson from the University of Maryland at Baltimore County. So first of all, many of you may already be familiar with African American language, but if you aren't, this is a language variety that has played an important role in the development of English sociolinguistics and the development of that science over the past 60 plus years. And work in this field has been done by a ton of scholars who I want to acknowledge today, folks like William Labov, Geneva Smitherman, Walt Wolfram, John Rickford, Elaine Chun, Tracy Weldon, Gerard McClendon, Mary Buckholtz, Marceliana Morgan, Sharice King, down to the present day, folks like Jamal Muwakil and Danielle Green. So there's a ton of people who've been doing this work, and that's the work that we want to attend to and build upon in this talk. So African American language played a central role, as I mentioned, in the development of sociolinguistics, and it's one of the most extensively researched varieties of the English language. It's covered in many college courses in linguistics, as we know from a survey done about 20 years ago by Tracy Weldon, who I mentioned earlier. And it's probably addressed in many English and education courses as well, and courses in other departments too, in some cases. However, despite the importance of this language variety and its well-researched nature, it's still subjected to widespread racist anti-Black stigmatization in the United States. Each of us has a moral and professional responsibility as language arts educators, as language educators, as teacher educators, to actively combat the stigmatization. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, as well as the sort of implications it has for teaching of global Englishes in contexts outside the United States. So this project we call Teaching About African American Language in Educational Settings, or TALES, addresses the fact that there's limited information on how AAL is taught to college students, even though AAL, or African American language itself, is extensively researched. It also addresses the fact that Black faculty in the United States must navigate the politics surrounding Black language in their careers, even though they've been marginalized in linguistics research. And we also, of course, need more sort of open access supports for teaching about AAL. And this, again, sort of informed and motivated this study. And we currently have a paper. The information I'm going to be sharing with you today, some of our initial results, are currently under review. So some of you may even have been reviewers on that. So thank you if you were, because we really appreciated the feedback we got on our revise and resubmit recently. So in the late summer and early autumn of 2021, my colleagues and I distributed a survey on social media and a variety of email lists, reaching out to linguists, to educators, to college instructors, sort of as far and wide as possible across the United States and to a limited extent beyond the United States, to ask about folks who were teaching about African American language in their courses. What you can see here is within the US, the geographic distribution of institutions where one or more instructors responded to the survey. We also had folks from 3 other countries around the world who responded. And in terms of the sort of basic demographics of who took part, we surveyed 149 instructors across multiple disciplines. Those included linguistics, education, English, communication sciences, and a number of other departments like anthropology, bilingual education, sort of more specific, et cetera. And a couple of the courses people taught were cross-listed across multiple departments. 69% of the respondents were tenure-line faculty, 30% were clinical faculty, postdocs, or graduate students. 17% were themselves, they identified themselves as users of African American language, and the remainder did not. And 78% have actually interacted regularly with users of African American language at some point during their lives. We also asked about the racial identities of our survey respondents. About 2/3 identified as white or European American, about 1/6 identified solely as Black or African American, and the remainder mostly listed more than one racial or ethnic identity, as well as a couple of folks who identified as Asian or Asian American, Hispanic, Latino, or Latino American, or did not report a racial or ethnic identity. And it's important to talk about people's language backgrounds and their racial and ethnic identities because these affect the way that we teach about language in the United States, and particularly African-American language, because it is so heavily stigmatized and because that stigma is rooted in racism and not in linguistics. The sort of dynamics of teaching about AAL are really important to unpack. Interestingly, actually, we found nearly all of the courses that included this content met departmental or university requirements, especially in linguistics and English and in communication sciences or speech language pathology. Education did have more courses that were classified by the university as electives, but many of those courses actually met like a teacher education program requirement. In fact, 70% of all education courses represented in the survey met some sort of teacher education program requirements. So it's interesting to see that this content was like mostly in required courses. We also found that instructors who taught this content reported getting support from outside one's institution, so like colleagues at other colleges and universities or from professional organizations, a bit more often than from colleagues within their own institution. So that tells us something about sort of like who has access to support for this content. Most people get support, but they have to look beyond their own universities and departments to do it. And we'll talk in a few minutes about why that's important. We also found that Black faculty and African-American language using faculty encountered more extreme student attitudes than did white faculty. We asked respondents to the survey to talk about whether students were enthusiastic to learn about African-American language, whether students were resistant, whether they were neutral. And what we see is that white faculty overall, across these categories, most faculty reported their students were enthusiastic to learn this content. But white faculty had a greater proportion of neutral responses. And Black faculty and AAL using faculty, those two categories overlap a lot, but they're not identical by any means, reported sort of greater rates of student resistance and less neutrality. So that resistance sort of plays into the importance of unpacking people's positionality and the sort of politics and dynamics of teaching this content at the college level. So to get into the sort of more qualitative details, Black faculty in the survey experienced specific and varied challenges to teaching about African-American language. So Black faculty who also identified as African-American language users sometimes talked about student resistance, right? Students questioned my objectivity in talking about the stigmatized language variety, or in courses that are not focused on African-American language or African-American literature, there's not enough time in the syllabus allotted for students to learn about AAL holistically, right? Maybe it's confined to sort of like a single topic, a single day, a single example, rather than being something that's sort of given the time to really unpack the complexities and historical context surrounding this language variety. Also, in talking with instructors who identify as Black but are not users of African-American language, they talked about the struggle of sort of just not having familiarity with this language variety, given that they're not users of it. And then when we talked to non-Black faculty, they reported sort of, in some cases different and in some cases the same challenges for teaching about AAL. So non-Black faculty who were not AAL users, said things like, I'm white and I'm not a native speaker. I try to use Black author texts and examples and to remain aware of potential problematic stereotypes in examples. But as someone who doesn't have lived experience as an AAL speaker, there's no doubt that I make errors, both grammatical and sociocultural in nature. I always want to be truthful and upfront with my students about aspects of discrimination and profiling in our society, but it's hard to walk the line of illustrating these points for my non-Black students who often come into the classroom without a lot of awareness or critical thinking tools to tackle the realities of racism, without rehashing what may be traumatic experiences and realities for my students of color, and especially for my Black students. So, this is telling us there's a lot of complexity to navigate. And in fact, this shows up as well in instructors' confidence in teaching about African-American language, and also then relatedly, perhaps teaching about African-American culture, right? So in second language classes, we often sort of engage in learning about language. We also engage in learning about the cultures that are associated with certain language varieties. But that's complicated in the United States, where conversations about race and racism are politically charged in many cases. And so what we see, Blackness is not a monolith, and Black or African-American instructors, some of them felt very confident talking about African-American language and culture in their classes, but a lot of them felt only quite or somewhat confident. And among non-Black instructors, we can see folks had more confidence and knowledge for teaching about African-American language than they had for teaching about African-American culture. And so this potentially shows up in the ways that they then teach, right? Do they teach about African-American language and talk about its sort of historical context, the racism that underlies a lot of the stigma surrounding it? Or do they just sort of hold it up as here is a little piece of information about language, and now we're going to move on to something else? So it's important to unpack that distinction and how it plays into our pedagogy. So again, we found Black faculty and AAL users were more likely to encounter student resistance or pushback. Most faculty members with AAL expertise, sort of more than 50%, seems to be sort of the only one or one of only a few in their department. They didn't report getting support from colleagues within their own institution. Faculty often had to persuade their colleagues of the importance of teaching and researching AAL. And so this plays into then the dynamics and strategies that we want to think about for teaching AAL, and those may also apply to teaching of other global Englishes, particularly stigmatized varieties around the Pacific Rim, in different countries around the world. So we're going to talk about some practical sort of suggestions and recommendations that these findings evoked from my colleagues and I. So at the classroom level, we want to give students time throughout a course to discuss student and professor positionalities. And for these, we can look at things like linguistic autobiography assignments, where students sort of are asked to engage in their personal sort of ideologies of language and how their own use of language is seen by others and is seen by society. My colleagues have published about that in their recent book, Talking College, and some other places, so you can see those articles if you're interested. We also want to encourage instructors to focus on culture as well as language variation to avoid the sort of decontextualization and marginalization of AAL and other stigmatized Englishes, right? If we're learning Spanish and we're learning about the culture and history of Spain or Mexico or Colombia, we don't want to sort of like put AAL off to the side as this thing where we only are going to talk about the language and we're never going to speak about the culture or the history. It's important to address those things. We also, one of the challenges that we sort of see in the data are that like instructors, many of the instructors teaching this content are white or other non-Black instructors who don't want to sort of be appropriative. And so one way around that is to bring in guest speakers who are themselves users of AAL or other stigmatized Englishes. And of course, we want to financially compensate those people for their labor and coming in to speak with our class. And again, to sort of avoid being appropriative, we want to emphasize citing racially marginalized scholars when we're teaching and writing about language varieties that are associated with racially marginalized communities, like African-American language in the United States, like other global Englishes in other contexts. And we also want to build and share and access and use open source repositories, syllabi, and other resources that can help promote the teaching of this really important content. At the department or college level, we want, our findings about the sort of required nature of many of these courses suggest if our goal is to sort of undo a lot of the stigmatization of AAL and other varieties of English, we might be more successful not by sort of creating new elective courses and trying to recruit students to them, but by just integrating this content into existing courses that already meet departmental or university requirements, or by pursuing approval for existing courses that have this content to count towards requirements. We also want to think about how student resistance to instruction on stigmatized language varieties can factor into course evaluation data. And it might be helpful to sort of integrate that content in multiple courses across, multiple instructors, rather than sort of put all the impetus and all the the work and all the risk of teaching that content on a single instructor. So this is going to require universities to identify or hire multiple instructors with this expertise, or at least offer professional development on these topics for instructors who are already there. One way to do this might be interdisciplinary cluster hires of faculty who studied marginalized language varieties and cultures from an emic sort of lived experience perspective. So that would be one strategy we recommend at the university level. I want to leave you with a couple of questions to ponder, and I believe my 15 minutes are up. So I'm going to say thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to address any questions that you might have. Thank you.